Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I would like to welcome all of you back to my 500 Movies in 2025 series. And this is going to be part two of Summer Camp Week. So if you caught my first part of Summer Camp Week a few days ago, where I talked about the first three Sleepaway Camp movies, you'll know that I, kind of summarized my experience with Summer Camp, my personal experience from when I was a kid. I went there, and just my love for these kinds of movies revolving around summer camp uh, ever since I was a kid, and just how special they are to me. And I won't go over that again. If you guys want to hear me talk about that at the beginning of the last episode, you can go back and listen to that if you've not already seen it. So on part one, I talked about three different movies, which is the first three Sleepaway Camp movies. Um, so I'm just going to just dive right into this episode because I have a lot of movies. I have 7 different movies to talk about tonight, so I'm going to try to get through them fairly quickly. And I'm calling this the Summer Cinematic Sizzlers because these are some of my absolute favorite films ever since I was a kid, up to some of the ones that I've seen more recently for the first time. That I've just that I have come to know. There's a ton of movies out there, other than the ones that I've covered in the past, like the Friday the 13th movies and Sleepaway Camp movies, that all kind of revolve around summer camps. But of course, I can't cover them all within like one week, one themed week here on the channel. There's a lot more that I could cover later on down the road, maybe in the next year, next summer or something. But I just wanted to kind of cover some of my absolute favorites for this episode. And let me go ahead and just jump right into that, I guess. So, this first movie, now, this has been a favorite of mine for many, many years. I've seen this one several times. And this movie was actually released on June 29th, 1979. And that's exactly 46 years ago from today. And I'm talking about the absolute classic, legendary summer camp film starring Bill Murray, directed by Ivan Reitman, and that's Meatballs. Now, as a longtime fan of both the comedic genius, of Bill Murray, and just the masterful, just directorial touch of Ivan Reitman, this film really holds a truly special place in my heart. It's more than just a movie. It's a time machine. Back to those simpler times, and really just that undeniable starting point for two careers that would define a generation of comedy. Now, while perhaps it's not as universally, acclaimed as some, of their later collaborations together, especially Ghostbusters, Meatballs is just an absolute, I think, cornerstone, an essential piece of that puzzle that reveals the core charm and brilliance that made those guys icons. And at its core, Meatballs is this rowdy, heartfelt, and surprisingly like low key, summer camp comedy. And it was set at the perpetually struggling, mismatched Camp North Star. And the film centers around this group of kind of quirky, often like hapless teenage counselors, and they're even more awkward campers. It's less about a rigid plot and more about capturing that feeling, of summer camp, just the fleeting friendships, the just the awkward crushes, the petty rivalries, and just that feeling of being away from home, and just finding this temporary like weird family. And the story of this movie revolves primarily around Tripper Harrison, which is played by Bill Murray. He's the head counselor of of this underdog cabin they call, I think it's called Pinecone. And Tripper isn't your typical authority figure. He's this mischievous, anarchy field like force of nature, that's more interested in pulling pranks and chasing girls than he is like enforcing rules that at the camp. But beneath that whole slacker, exterior lies this surprisingly, empathetic and genuinely caring person. And I think this is most evident in his relationship with Rudy, who's this introverted, lonely kid that's struggling to fit in. And Tripper takes Rudy, kind of under his wing, not like in a sappy, like over sentimental way or anything, but with that kind of more characteristic Murray esque, like playful teasing and that kind of unconventional encouragement. Um, their evolving friendship really kind of forms this emotional backbone of the movie. And the stakes, that involve the annual Olympiad competition, at the end of the movie, against this ridiculously well funded, you know, and this arrogant rival Camp Mohawk. North Star is, they're expected to like lose this competition, spectacularly as always. But the real drama isn't about winning here. It's about the campers and the counselors, finding their confidence and just navigating their insecurities and just kind of finding these small victories, in a world that seems determined to just to make them feel like losers. But this film is just a series of like vignettes all throughout it. There's these chaotic wake up calls that are masterminded by Tripper. Just these kind of awkward social mixers, these canoe races that are gone wrong. Um, the counselors trying and failing at times to be cool. And just Bill Murray's, Tripper, just generally being Bill Murray pretty much. It just kind of perfectly captures that specific brand of that summer camp magic, that feeling that anything can happen, just often involving, a large body of water and questionable decisions. Um, it's less polished than like later comedies, leaning heavily on kind of improvisation, which Bill Murray was really known for a lot of improvisation, on his films. And but this relies on that and just kind of that natural chemistry of the cast, just especially that magnetic presence of Bill Murray. Um, and like I said, Ivan Reitman was the director of this beautiful summer chaos film. And Reitman, he became kind of this formidable force in comedy, at this time. Both as a producer and a director. And before Meatballs, he had produced films like David Cronenberg's, early horror films like Shivers and Rabbit. And he also did like, this low budget National Lampoon stage show called Lemmings, which also featured Bill Murray and John Belushi was in that. Um, but Meatballs was Ivan Reitman's first major feature, and it was an absolute success. He would go on to become, synonymous with some of the biggest and most beloved comedies of the '80s and the '90s. And we're talking about absolute classics, like Stripes, like the iconic Ghostbusters, which both of them feature Bill Murray. And then he went on to work with some other movies that I've talked about here on the channel in the past, involving Arnold Schwarzenegger, like Twins and Kindergarten Cop. And and he did a ton of stuff out there. And and he was just really known for, he had this incredible knack for working with these strong, these often improv comedic actors like Bill Murray, like Dan Aykroyd, like Harold Ramis, like John Belushi, Dan DeVito, Arnold Schwarzenegger, in that comedic context, because, we really started to see, and I talked about this in the past when I was doing the Arnold and the Schwarzenegger and Stallone films. He really Schwarzenegger, he really kind of start to open up to that whole comedy aspect of his career when he started working with Ivan Reitman. And Ivan Reitman, he knew how to harness all of those guys' energy and just kind of give them this room to play, and but also really shape the chaos into this kind of cohesive, entertaining film. And Meatballs, I think, is a prime example of this, which allows Bill Murray to really shine while keeping that overall story grounded, well, relatively speaking, but he was able to really balance, a lot of heart and humor in his films too. And his best films, with Meatballs included, aren't just these joke machines all throughout. They really have this genuine heart to them. You know what I mean? He finds like that emotional core in these absurd situations, and just allows moments, of real connection to breathe kind of amidst all the silliness. And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier about that whole relationship between Tripper and Rudy in the movie Meatballs. And just I think that's a perfect testament to that aspect of Ivan Reitman's films. um and just he really created all these kind of beloved ensembles by putting together these casts where the chemistry just was fantastic. I mean, the whole Ghostbusters team is like, I think, is probably the most famous example. But even that collection, of counselors and campers in Meatballs feels like a real like dysfunctional family. And Meatballs, while it was more of what they call a sleeper hit, um, Ivan Reitman really played a significant role in shaping the landscape, of this film, and just where it was commercially extremely successful. And just like, and he would go on to continue being successful, and where he would almost dominate, the 80s and 90s in the whole comedy genre. Um, and I think when it comes to the legacy and the impact of this movie, especially when you're a Bill Murray fan, you're an Ivan Reitman fan, it's just sometimes it comes off as profound, really understated compared to their later blockbusters that Murray and Reitman would work on together. Um, and I think perhaps most significantly, Meatballs really launched Bill Murray as a bona fide movie star. Before this, he was known primarily, for Saturday Night Live. But that character of Tripper Harrison, was his first leading role, and he just absolutely owns this. I mean, that's why I'm such a fan of Bill Murray, because from the moment he came onto a movie screen, he just friggin' owns it, and he's just an absolutely a genius when it comes to comedy. I love Bill Murray, and just that I think the film, it really perfectly captures his unique, slightly cynical, but that lovable persona that he has. Um, his performance here is absolutely hilarious, and at times in this film surprisingly touching. I love that friendship that him and Rudy create, because like it's like, he's just trying to take Rudy under his wing. He's trying to make him fit in, and not be a loner, off to himself all the time. And it's very inspiring. I love that. And just the whole iconic "it just doesn't matter" speech that he delivers to Rudy before that final competition is just this kind of masterclass in comedic timing. That kind of intersects with this, um, I guess what I'm saying is it became instantly quotable, and just cemented Murray's ability to deliver lines that were simultaneously absurd, like "it just doesn't matter, it just does not matter," and just kind of deeply resonate, with things like "unless it matters to you." And this movie really proved that he could carry a film, and connect with an audience on almost this emotional level, not just make them laugh and all that, but it was, I feel like this was the stepping stone to when he would go into do Caddyshack and Stripes and Ghostbusters, and everything that followed. Um, but going back to Ivan Reitman though, Meatballs was his directorial breakout hit. It showed Hollywood that he could handle, feature filmmaking and just deliver this kind of these box office returns. And like I said, it was a movie was a massive hit, and it was on a small budget, and it really laid that groundwork, for his signature style, and undoubtedly helped him, land opportunities to direct, bigger films with bigger stars, like culminating with Ghostbusters. And you can just see, all those kind of seeds of his ability to just kind of start to blend together with all the the chaos with these character moments here. Um, and well, next I also wanted to mention that Meatballs really struck a chord. I think culturally, it just kind of really tapped into that universal experience of summer camp. And just kind of capturing its the that genuine awkwardness and freedom and just these kind of formative moments throughout the film. And while it was not the first camp movie, of course, I mean it became a reference point for later films. It influenced that kind of vibe, if not the specific plot points or whatever, but it would really have that same kind of vibe that you would see in later films throughout the 80s and the 90s and so forth. Um, it just really felt authentic, to just a certain kind of slightly unsupervised and raunchy, genuine fun, summer experience. Its low budget charm and I think focus on characters, over that spectacle, really gave it this very distinct, enduring appeal. And I think finally, I just want to mention for fans like myself, Meatballs represents this kind of perfect capsule of that early raw, comedic talent before it was, smoothed by massive budgets and global fame. And I mean, it's scrappy, it's silly, it has imperfections, but overall, I think this is a beautiful film. I love it. It really captures that essence of what makes Bill Murray so captivating. His like sheer unpredictability and that improvisational skill that he's so good at, and just that, and also there's just that ability to find the human truth in most ridiculous situations, which I love that as well. It really showcases, Ivan Reitman's early skill in wrangling that energy into a narrative that, just, despite its kind of episodic nature, it really manages to build to moments that genuinely pay off. Um, but I guess in conclusion, Meatballs is far more than just a late '70s cheap comedy. It's that foundational text for the Bill Murray that we know and love on screen. And it's directed by the man who helped bring that persona to its plot, to its greatest heights. And it's a film about underdogs, about finding your place. It's about just this utterly memorable chaos, of summer, and it might just be a simple story, about a bunch of weirdos at camp, but for fans like myself of Bill Murray and Ivan Reitman, it's an essential, and just profoundly impactful piece of comedic history. It just, well, so to speak, it does matter. So if I want to end that on a note that's related to the film, I will say this film, it does matter. But yeah, absolutely check out Meatballs if you're just you're a summer camp movie fan. You're just you're a comedy fan in general. You're a Bill Murray fan. You've never seen this movie. Definitely take the time and watch it. Before the summer ends. And if you've been to summer camp as a kid, uh, definitely go back and watch this, cause like it will bring back a lot of nostalgic things for you, I think. Um, But moving on, switching gears a little bit to for the next film. Um, I, so we're going to go over to the horror genre for a second and talk about what I think is one of the absolute heavyweights of the early '80s slasher boom, and it's a film that really deserves far more credit than it often gets, and that's The Burning from 1981. Um, and as a certified slasher horror movie fan myself, um, it is the kind I'm the kind who appreciates, that high body count, these creative kills, a memorable villain, and practical effects done right. The Burning isn't just a movie from that era. I think it's a prime example of what made that subgenre so unsettling and fun. And at its heart, The Burning is this classic summer camp slasher, but it kind of takes that familiar setting and elevates it with just these genuinely disturbing, this backstory and these top tier special effects, and just a sense of dread, despite that whole sunny environment. Um, the premise of this is deceptively simple, and this group of campers decides to play a cruel prank, on the camp caretaker, who's this seemingly grumpy but mostly harmless guy named Cropsy. And their prank involves this worm riddled skull with like a candle in it, and he's sleeping inside this dark cabin where they put him, but it goes horrifically wrong when the fire gets knocked over. After he wakes up, he sees it, and and he gets scared to death, knocks over the skull, and the candle in it starts setting everything on fire. And it ends up leaving him hideously burned and disfigured. So years later, he's after this extended stay in this hospital and infirmary of some sort. Cropsy is like released or escapes or whatever. But he's not healed. He's consumed by this burning rage, and just a thirst for vengeance against all these campers, these counselors. So he heads back to the woods. Specifically targeting this summer camp called Camp Blackfoot, which is directly to the original incident. Um, the film then kind of introduces us to this diverse group of teenagers and these young adults and counselors and older campers, and they're really just navigating this kind of typical summer camp life, swimming and flirting, playing pranks, facing crushes, dealing with bullies, just generally having a good time. And this is where the film really excels in building a sense of normalcy and even likability among all the potential victims. So you get the jocks, the shy kids, the confident ones, the awkward ones, and really what makes The Burning particularly notable in this regard is its casting. And if you look closely, you'll spot early appearances by future stars like Jason Alexander, like Holly Hunter, and Fisher Stevens. And seeing these now famous faces in peril really adds a layer of that meta enjoyment for modern viewers of this film. And then going back to Cropsy, who he's armed with this nasty pair of garden shears, which to me is an iconic slasher weapon choice. I mean, let's be honest. He just starts to begin his rampage here. He's not just silently stalking in the woods. He's this absolute force of nature, just driven by his disfigurement and his trauma. And the film, expertly presents the bright, kind of lively atmosphere of this summer camp day with the dark, terrifying nights where Cropsy hunts. So the isolation, of the camp setting is key. They're surrounded by woods and water, and escape is difficult. Help is far away, and the plot follows this like typical slasher structure. You introduce the cast, build some kind of minor drama and relationships, and just you introduce the threat, escalate the kills, just narrow down narrow the focus down to a few survivors, leading to this kind of final confrontation. But The Burning executes this formula with exceptional skill, I feel. I mean, I absolutely love this movie. So, and particularly in its pacing and crucially for fans like me of this film, I just think it has a lot of unforgettable death sequences. Um, and I'll get into that in just a bit, but first I want to talk about the director of this movie. So the director of The Burning is Tony Malum. Now, if you're a horror fan, Malum is primarily known for this movie. I mean, he's not a director with an extensive filmography in the horror genre, or even necessarily like a household name or anything, in Hollywood circles. It's beyond this film. But his background is, I think, perhaps more rooted in like documentary and TV work before The Burning. And after this film, he directed a few other movies across different genres, including Split Second from 1992, which stars Rutger Hauer. Great movie. I was just talking with my friend Dana about that movie just the other night on her streams, and which that movie has its own cult following, but it's quite different from The Burning. But he also directed like kind of these sports documentaries and TV series and stuff too. And but while he isn't a horror director like Wes Craven or John Carpenter or Sean Cunningham, who became synonymous with all these different franchises in horror. The Burning stands, I think, as his undeniable legacy within just the horror community, the horror genre. He really demonstrated this like real knack, I think, here for building suspense and capturing that atmosphere of the camp, and perhaps I think most importantly, or at least thanks to his effects artists, kind of staging these utterly brutal and memorable death scenes. He took a relatively standard slasher script and turned it into this genuinely effective horror film. And I really think that's a testament, to his ability to deliver this, this impactful genre filmmaking, even if it wasn't, a path that he pursued extensively afterwards. Um, but going back to what I said earlier about, that help from his effects artist that made this movie so memorable, let's talk about that. So Tom Savini was, the effects artist on The Burning. And I think this is arguably probably the biggest part of The Burning's legacy for horror fans. So the film features, this these practical special effects by the legendary Tom Savini. And this was fresh off of him working on Friday the 13th just a year prior, and then a few years before this, he did effects on Dawn of the Dead. And Savini, I've even heard him people say that he considers his effects work in The Burning some of his best. And I think it's hard to argue that. The kills here are very creative, they're shocking, and they're just executed with this stunning, brutal realism for that time. And if you look at probably what is the most famous, like kill scene, gore scene, whatever you want to call it, from this film, and that's the raft scene. I mean, this scene alone is worth the price of admission, I think, for any gorehound. So, there's this group of campers on this raft in the middle of the lake, and they're attacked by Cropsey, and and this leads to this multi-kill sequence involving the garden shears, and really that's kind of artistic in its horror, and that it's utterly convincing. It's this master class in just practical effects mayhem, and just remains, I think, one of the most notorious death scenes in slasher history. um and then if you look at other memorable effects, including like the neck slicing and all the various stabbings and mutilations, all that, Savini's work here really set a high bar for practical effects in the early 80s, I think, and really solidified, his reputation as that go-to guy for, all this realistic cinematic violence. Um, so just the film really faced a lot of significant, censorship issues, just due to the intensity of these effects, and which I think that contributed to its kind of initial, you distribution challenges, but also cemented its legendary status among fans who sought out all these uncut versions of all these different films. And looking at the actual Cropsey legend and just the urban folklore of it all, the film really draws inspiration from that real life Cropsey urban legend that popular like in the northeastern United States, particularly Staten Island. About this boogeyman figure who lurks in the woods, often tied to these kind of abandoned institutions. Um, and while the film takes liberties with that legend, it really tapped into this kind of pre-existing um, regional fear, giving its killer a foundation in local folklore that made him feel, slightly more grounded, in a twisted way, than some of these like masked villains that were, in horror films of that era. Um, and like I said earlier, like Jason Alexander's in this, and the whole cast list here is just a gold mine for fans of 80s and 90s movies and TV. And just seeing that baby face Jason Alexander, who would go on to be George Costanza from Seinfeld, as this goofy, slightly awkward counselor Dave. And then you have Holly Hunter, who would, was in a small supporting role here. And then Fisher Stevens, he would go on to do Short Circuit, Hackers. It's just a delight to see those people. While they weren't stars yet, um, their presence really adds this interesting layer, I think, to the history of the film and the whole appeal that it brings. Jason Alexander in particular has this significant role in the film and kind of handles that blend of comedy and terror very well within his character. Um, and just the cult status and everything regarding this film, despite the quality of the effects and the execution and everything, The Burning never achieved that franchise status or name recognition, of Friday the 13th or A Nightmare on Elm Street. You know, this was likely due to a combination of factors. Well, one, a lot of people consider The Burning a Friday the 13th ripoff. And I can see that. I get that. But, I think one of the biggest things regarding that is just the distribution issues that was related to like censorship and perhaps just getting lost in that sheer volume of slasher output from the early 80s, because there was a ton of slasher movies coming out just in the early 80s. But however, among all these dedicated slasher fans and these gore hounds, it really quickly gained this reputation through VHS and later DVD and Blu-ray releases, just like a ton of horror films out there have done. Um, it's widely considered to a lot of fans as this underrated gem or this lost classic that stands alongside or even surpasses many more famous films of the excuse me of the subgenre in terms of like sheer impact and practical effects and all that. And just its legacy is one that's cherished by those in the know. A film that's passed along through recommendations among horror enthusiasts. And I mean, yeah, I mean, this is an absolute underrated gem. I feel, and I think some people say, well, it's not really underrated. I think a lot of people know about this. Well, yeah, horror fans know about this film, but people that aren't really like in the know and aren't like hardcore into the genre or the horror community, I mean, The Burning is not one of those films that is like really like everybody knows it. You know what I mean? It's not like it because like how everybody knows Friday the 13th, everybody knows Halloween, everybody knows Nightmare on Elm Street, but not everybody has knows The Burning or has heard of The Burning. But I guess in conclusion, for a slasher fan like myself, The Burning is to me essential viewing. It's really got this effective, sympathetic setup, and this kind of legitimately, terrifying killer with this clear motivation, which is a beautiful example of just kind of this idyllic setting and gruesome horror, and and just more importantly, I mean, some of the finest, most brutal practical effects ever committed to a slasher film, and that's courtesy of the legendary Tom Savini. So I think that this is a cornerstone, of '80s slashers. A film that really delivers, the goods with that brutality and just deserves its place. I think in that world of these great horror slashers. And if you appreciate that craft of this practical gore, of the '80s, just that that tension of a kind of stalk and slash type film, and just and or even spotting like these future A-listers like Jason Alexander or Holly Hunter, just getting terrorized. Do yourself a favor and watch The Burning if you've never seen it. I don't think you'll be disappointed. Um, but now moving on to back to another lighter side of film. Um, this next movie was one of the earliest summer camp comedies that I remember watching, and was very well possibly the reason that I fell in love with this character. And I actually got that character with me today, and that's Ernest P. Worrell. He's missing his hat. He still talks, if you can hear it on the mic. So I had to bring him out for this, as tonight we're going to be talking about Ernest Goes to Camp. And if there's one, you know, guy that knew how to make you laugh, till your sides hurt, and even got a little lump in your throat, it was Ernest P. Worrell. You know what I mean? And while he had a whole string of adventures of going to jail, going to Africa, going to school, fighting trolls on Halloween, you name it. There is one that just stands out like a sore thumb to me, and in really the best possible way, because it's just a nostalgic thing for me, because this is how I was introduced to the Ernest character. I grew up watching this movie on repeat all the time. And that's Ernest Goes to Camp. Yeah, I mean, this movie is pure gold. I think it kind of feel good fun that really sticks with you through a lifetime. And now there's some folks that I have run across, though, that they just don't get the appeal of Ernest. That they see this goofy face, these catchphrases, and and everything. Like they call it bad acting, and they dismiss him and the character. But really, I feel that they're missing the heart, of the matter here. Ernest wasn't just this funny guy. He was this everyman, trying his best, always looking for a little bit of connection and a whole lot of fun. And Ernest Goes to Camp. That's where I think he is one of the films that he truly shines, where you see this genuine, goodness underneath all this, this ridiculousness that's happening with his character. You know, so let's dive into what this movie is, because I feel like it's more than just slapstick. Although there is plenty of slapstick comedy in this film, but I feel like there's a lot more to that. But so if you just picture this, there's this Camp Kikiki, which is this good old summer camp, full of kids looking for adventure and maybe getting away from mom and dad for a bit. But but things ain't looking good for this camp. There are these greedy developers, who have been eyeballing the land and in the camp itself, and the camp really needs that little something extra, to keep it afloat. And that's where we enter Ernest P. Worrell. And he ain't no high, fluting counselor or anything yet. No, he is just the maintenance man. He's this guy fixing the toilets, mowing the grass, just generally making sure that the place doesn't fall apart. He's got dreams though. He wants to be a counselor. To hang out with the kids, lead hikes. Teach archery. You name it. But the head counselor, Tipton, he just sees Ernest as a goofball and a liability. He tells Ernest that he's built for maintenance, not for molding these young minds, which is very disappointing for Ernest, of course. Well, as fate would have it, though, Ernest has to go pick up this busload of these juvenile delinquents. And these ain't your typical campers. They're these tough kids, sent to this camp as a community service after getting into trouble, back home. So they've got chips on their shoulders, ain't nobody they trust, and they sure don't want to be out in the woods. And guess who gets stuck with the job of looking after this bunch after the counselor Stennis refuses to work with them? That's right, our man Ernest. So the other counselors think that this is a surefire way to prove that Ernest is a failure. But here's where the magic happens with Ernest Goes to Camp. So Ernest, with his kind of unending optimism and just complete lack of conventional sense, he starts trying to connect with these kids. It's not easy. They pull pranks on him. They're disrespectful to him. They try to run away, but Ernest, he just keeps coming back with a smile. Plans that usually backfire. He sees the potential in them, even when they don't see it themselves. And meanwhile, while all this is going on, the threat to the camp is still growing. These developers, which is led by Sherman Crater, who's played by John Vernon, not Crater like me, but Crater, Krader. So, yeah, this is a bad dude. And then, like, the old chief, St. Cloud, back over at Camp Kikiki, he's the heart and soul of this camp, and other than Ernest, of course, and he's the one who inherited the land, so he's resistant, but the pressure is on here, you know. So what happens? Ernest and these troublesome kids, they got to band together. They face challenges where they got to prove their worth, and ultimately, have this showdown with these greedy developers who just want to tear everything down. So, in a sense, it's like that classic underdog story. You've got that well-meaning but clumsy hero. You got these tough kids who need guidance. These grumpy authority figures. And you got the wise elder Chief Saint Cloud and his granddaughter, Nurse Saint Cloud, and just these clear cut bad guys. So the plot is straightforward, but it's the spirit of it that really makes it work. You know what I mean? And just Ernest uses his unique brand of genius, I guess you could call it, which often involves like massive explosions and these bizarre contraptions, or just sheer luck, really, just to help save the day. He teaches the kids about teamwork and loyalty and believing in yourself. And the kids in turn, they start to see Ernest not just as this goofball, but as someone who actually cares about them, someone who wants to give them a chance. So the movie is just packed with all this genuinely funny physical comedy. Jim Varney was just a genius at this, and he was a Kentucky boy like myself, and just the way that he reacts to getting hurt or surprised, it's just perfect. That is perfect innocent fun. But as I said, there's heart in this movie too. The moments where Ernest is connecting with these kids, those are what really elevate it beyond just a series of gags. And let me just take a break for just a second. Let me get a drink real quick first. And but let me talk about the director of what I consider to be a masterpiece. And he's pretty much the man behind the whole Ernest universe, and that's John Cherry. So John Cherry is the man when it comes to Ernest, other than Jim Varney, of course. But see, before the movies, Ernest was this guy that was just known in commercials like Sprite, I think, and Mellow Yellow, and just a lot of other like advertisements. That just in these are in like local markets, like all over the country. And John Cherry is the one who created those commercials. And he and Jim Varney worked together for years, developing that Ernest character, throughout these kind of short, funny bits and all these movies that they did together. So when it came time to make their first full length movie, who better to direct than the guy who knew Ernest, inside and out? And John Cherry directed, the vast majority of the Ernest films. I think one of the only ones he didn't do was Ernest Goes to School, I think. But he did Ernest Goes to Camp, Ernest Saves Christmas, Ernest Goes to Jail, Ernest Scared Stupid, Ernest Rides Again, Ernest Goes to Africa, Ernest in the Army. He understood the character's voice, his humor, and just what made people connect with that character. Um, and as far as the legacy of this movie, particularly, this movie just single-handedly launched, that major film franchise that I talked about. And before this movie, he was just a commercial star. But after this movie came out, I mean, it hit it big at the box office, and just suddenly, Ernest P. Worrell was a movie star. It proved that people, would pay to see Ernest on the big screen, and it kicked off nearly just like this decade of all these theatrical releases and even more like direct to video films. Without Ernest Goes to Camp, the world might not have gotten to see Ernest battle a troll or save Christmas or join the army or whatever, or go to jail and like have these electricity powers. But we'll talk about that at another time. This movie was just the foundation of all that, and it really solidified the whole Ernest formula. Ernest Goes to Camp established that template for most subsequent Ernest movies. Ernest in this new environment, a big problem he has to help solve. You know, uh, Often involving like a threat, to good people or places or whatever. And just this a sidekick or a group that he mentors, or there's a clear villain, and just this kind of mix of this broad comedy and unexpected moments of like sincerity. That was the formula for all of these Ernest movies, aside from like Slam Dunk Ernest, which I covered earlier in this film, which to me, that's probably the worst Ernest movie. I could care less if I ever see that one again. It's just, you can go back and watch my review on that back during my March Madness week of all the basketball films that I covered. But I mean, it's so different from any other Ernest movie, and I don't really want to talk about it anymore. But this one, has that formula that all those other great Ernest movies has, and that formula really resonated with audiences, especially kids and families, and who were looking for these, that simple, unpretentious entertainment. And I think maybe most importantly, from a fan's perspective, this movie really captured that heart, of the character. While Ernest was always funny in the commercials, Ernest Goes to Camp really gave him room to breathe, to show that he was more than just catchphrases. His relationship with the kids, the juvenile delinquent kids in this really added layers. You saw his genuine desire to want to help. His just frustration when things would go wrong. Though he rarely stayed down for long. And just that ultimate triumph, that not just in saving the camp, but in reaching those troubled kids. It just showed that Ernest had this big heart, and that really connected deeply with all the viewers of the movie and just the fans of that character. Um, and this movie really became a cornerstone of a lot of VHS collections for generations of kids in the late '80s and the '90s, myself included. It was just that kind of movie that you watched over and over again. The gags were funny to you. The characters were memorable, and just that overall message was absolutely positive. It wasn't cynical. It was earnest, pun intended, I guess there. But it reminded you that even the most unlikely people can, make a difference, and that everyone deserves is, a little bit of patience and understanding. Um, but the impact wasn't necessarily on critical acclaim. I mean, let's be honest. The critics often didn't really understand that appeal when it comes to Ernest. And again, you guys, if you've watched the channel before, you know how I feel about the critics. Always like, like, fuck off. I don't care what they think. I'm going to love what I love, and nobody can tell me different. But but like I said, it wasn't necessarily on that critical acclaim, but on cultural recognition and just that pure fun for families. Ernest became this household name. Know what I mean? Became like a widely recognized phrase, and that's, you guys have heard me say "know what I mean" a lot here on the channel. If you followed the channel for a while now, and that's because of Ernest. Because I grew up loving that character. I loving these movies that he was a part of, and just I always just thought it was so cool that Jim Varney was from Kentucky, and he kind of grew up in that same kind of culture that I grew up in. So like, I don't want to call it like that redneck or hillbilly or whatever, but it's just he had that same kind of accent as me. He talked in the kind of same type of slang as I did. Ernest was kind of looked at as a hero for me as a kid, and just so like kind of just adapting that whole know what I mean thing, and that's just a kind of part of my regular like vocabulary at this point. So, thank you, Ernest, for inspiring me to try to be like you or whatever. Right? Unless except I'm not trying to go to jail or fight trolls or save summer camps or anything. But I mean that would be cool too. But anyway, um, the movies, the Ernest movies though, starting with this one, were just that source of consistent, safe and just happy entertainment for just a whole generation. And looking back now, that movie really represents a simpler time in family entertainment. It doesn't rely on special effects or these complicated plots or anything. It relies more on the charisma and that comedic genius of Jim Varney. And just a story with clear stakes and heart, and it's just pure nostalgia. For a lot of people, it just has all this goofy humor and genuine emotion to it. Just the fact that it's still watched and remembered fondly by so many folks today, I think it really proves its lasting appeal. So yeah, Ernest Goes to Camp, to me, it's more than just a movie. It's where Ernest, became this movie hero. It's funny. It's got soul. It's the perfect example of why we loved this character in the first place. It set the stage for all these adventures. That to come and that gave us moments that we'll laugh at and feel good about for years to come. And if you haven't seen Ernest Goes to Camp, you really owe it to yourself to watch this movie. And of course, if you have seen Ernest Goes to Camp, well, it's probably time that you watch it again. You just can't beat Ernest. Know what I mean? So yeah, I love Ernest, and believe me, this is not going to be the last time I'm going to be talking about Ernest movies here on the channel for the end of this year. So there's got some more stuff, especially my favorite, Ernest Scared Stupid. Saving that for a little bit later around the Halloween season, but can't wait to come back to that world of Ernest P. Worrell. But moving on to the next film. So this next film, I only watched this film for the first time about a year ago. And for any of my fellow summer camp movie fans out there, if you're anything like me, you've spent countless hours, diving into a lot of these this world of these movie summer camps. You know the classics like the slashers that make you kind of double check, your tent, like Friday the 13th or Sleepaway Camp and stuff like that. The there's the comedies that perfectly capture that kind of awkwardness, of summer camps, like Meatballs and Wet Hot American Summer. Um, and then you got like dramas about finding yourself amongst the camp and all that. But then there are these weird ones, these films that really take that familiar setting and twist it, into something else entirely. And this next film that I'm going to be talking about is definitely one of those weird ones. And this is Summer Camp Nightmare from 1987. So let me tell you, finding this movie felt like discovering a forgotten cabin deep in the woods. Initially, maybe a bit, creaky and dusty, but this movie is full of just fascinating, unexpected things. It's not your you know, it, I was gonna say it's not your typical slasher in the woods film, but this is not even really a slasher. I mean, this is like a more of a thriller drama. I don't know. I really don't know what this movie is, but I think that this movie is great. I actually had a lot of fun with this movie. So when I watched it this week, this was only my second time watching it. But I think it's one of those films I'm gonna be, it's so weird. It's so like my type of film. It's one that I will definitely watch for years to come, over and over. Um, it's I think that's why it really kind of holds this special dark little corner of my summer camp movie heart. Um, and so imagine, if you will, there's this camp called Camp North Pines for boys, and the nearby camp South Pines for girls. And it's the summer of 1987, and things are pretty much what you expect. Kids running around, counselors trying and often failing to maintain order, and just that smell of impending rebellion. But this isn't just kids being kids. This is that simmering discontent, reaching this boiling point. And the film centers primarily on Camp North Pines and this particularly bright, charismatic, deeply deeply frustrated camper named Franklin. So Franklin has had enough. He enough rules, enough pointless activities, enough condescending adults. He's read his share of philosophy and theories on power, and he decides it's time for a revolution. So what follows is that core audacious premise, and it's Franklin, along with this core group of followers that he's rallied, including Runk the Punk, which is one of the best characters of this film. He's rallied all these kids from the camp and orchestrates this kind of complete takeover of the camp. And they're not just sneaking out after lights out. They're executing this meticulous plan. The counselors are like systematically rounded up, overpowered, and just imprisoned in this storage shed. The kids are suddenly in charge. All the kids, the cool ones, the nerds, the bullies, the shy ones, all of them. And this initially there's this euphoria, like there's no more rules. Everyone gets to do what they want, and it seems like the ultimate summer fantasy. But as anyone who's ever seen the movie or read the book Lord of the Flies, which this film clearly owes a debt to, uh, those people would know that absolute freedom without structure or authority quickly devolves into chaos. And Summer Camp Nightmare doesn't shy away from showing that descent at all. So this kid-run camp now, it starts to fall apart. Franklin tries to implement his own utopian vision, but maintaining control is harder than seizing it. So these factions emerge, disagreements start to escalate, and just the darker impulses of some of the campers come to the surface. What begins as a playful rebellion starts to turn serious and then dangerous, and then these food supplies become an issue, and basic safety breaks down, and just that idealism of this revolution kind of curves into this very terrifying display of just unchecked adolescent power and cruelty. And stuff starts to get surprisingly heavy with this film, and there are moments of just this genuine tension and fear, not from a mass killer or anything, but just from that kind of volatile, unpredictability of these unsupervised kids with that have too much control. So the film details these like power struggles within these kids' factions, and the attempts by all these imprisoned counselors to escape, and just that growing realization, that among many of the campers, that maybe just maybe that having adults in charge wasn't so bad after all. It captures that kind of specific feeling of isolation at camp, and it amplifies it by cutting off, the kids from the outside world, really making their small self-made society like their entire reality. And the director of this movie is Burt Dragan. Now, if you're a big film buff, his most famous credit might surprise you, and perhaps kind of make you understand that slightly eccentric tone of this movie, Summer Camp Nightmare. So, Burt Dragan is perhaps best known for directing Shock Treatment from 1981, which was kind of a sequel to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Now, I don't necessarily like Shock Treatment. I'm not a fan of Rocky Horror Picture Show at all, but I will tell you that Shock Treatment is this kind of very wild, satirical, musical with these strong anti-establishment themes. That filmed, entirely in the studio set and designed to look like a TV soundstage, a small town. It's a cult film in its own right, known for its kind of bizarre energy, and what people consider like catchy songs or whatever. I don't consider them catchy, but but it just has this tone, that swings, wildly between playful and critical of media and consumerism and all that. But let's be clear, Summer Camp Nightmare isn't a film that broke box office records, or it's wild or even wildly taught in film schools or anything. Its legacy isn't one of like massive mainstream success or or any kind of critical acclaim upon release, because I'm pretty sure that the only releases like on physical media of this movie was on VHS and Laserdisc. This has never gotten a DVD release. It's never had a Blu-ray release or anything. So, but I would love to have this movie on a newer format of whether it be Blu-ray, 4K, whatever. If that's even possible. But you know, for just a certain segment, of film fans, it's specifically those who appreciate these unique genre films, these '80s cult movies, and yes, these summer camp movies that have a twist to them. The legacy that this film brings is very significant, I think, and enduring. Its primary impact really lies in its utterly unique premise. You know, well, I mean, it's not really unique. Like I said, it's a lot like Lord of the Flies, but in a decade that saturated with summer camp slashers, many of them feeling kind of quite similar to one another. Summer Camp Nightmare, I think it really dared to do something different. It took that familiar setting and it kind of flipped the script, entirely. Exploring that more psychological and social horror rather than just kind of physical threats. You know what I mean? This makes it like a landmark film within the summer camp genre. I feel, at least in my opinion, and I think it proves that it's kind of versatility beyond stalk and kill narratives. It really carved out this really weird niche, movement amongst fans. Um, but I guess furthermore, the film really holds this very powerful socio-political, resonance to it. Even if it's unintentional, it really taps into that kind of timeless, anxieties about, generational conflict, that nature of like authority, and just that that corrupting influence of power, and the that fragility of order. While the premise is heightened for dramatic effect, the themes that it explores. I mean, like what happens when rules disappear? How do societies form? Can freedom exist without responsibility? These are all genuinely, I think, thought provoking. It really functions almost like a slightly trashier, 80s update of Lord of the Flies. And I think that's exactly why I love this movie. It's the impact isn't measured in millions of viewers, but in the way it's discovered by fans. Like I said, I only found out about this movie about a year ago. you know, when it's discovered by it's by people sometimes, no, not necessarily me, but there are fans out there who are tired of the same old themes with these types of films, and this film has really become a kind of a word of mouth film. Like I said, there is no updated physical media release of this. So it's more so just kind of passed along among enthusiasts, who appreciate the boldness and originality of films like this. It really stands as proof that the summer camp setting can be this kind of fertile ground for exploring this diverse narrative idea. Which is not just horror. It challenged the convention of the genre and just really offered a more darker, more complex vision of what a summer camp movie could be. Um, but I guess in essence, Summer Camp Nightmare is that of a cult classic. At least I would consider it a cult classic. It's a film that didn't really find this massive audience, initially, but has really endured because of its distinctiveness. It's a required watching for anyone out there. This is just me saying this. I think it's a required watching for anyone that's deep diving into the history of summer camp films and you want to see how far that genre can stretch out. It's now there are parts of this movie it can be a little bit disturbing, but it's often compelling, and I think always very memorable for just a lot of the sheer audacity with the stuff in this film. I definitely suggest checking it out. And from my perspective, somebody who genuinely loves these movies, um, Summer Camp Nightmare is awesome. It takes all the familiar elements, the cabins, the mess hall, the lake, the awkward social dynamics, and just injects them, with this kind of dose of pure, unpredictable anarchy. Um, plus it's got Chuck Connors. I mean, who doesn't love Chuck Connors? Tourist Trap, come on. But it's exciting because it's different. It makes you think. What would I do in that situation? It's this this dark fantasy kind of played out against this very sun drenched, seemingly innocent backdrop. And it's proof that the summer camp setting is really versatile and can host stories far beyond these mass killers or these funny guys like Bill Murray or Jim Varney. It's it's a perfect example, I think, of 80s genre filmmaking, pushing those boundaries in all these unexpected ways. So again, like I said, if you're a fellow fan of summer camp films and you've never watched Summer Camp Nightmare, definitely seek it out. Try to find a way to watch it. There are ways out there. I won't tell you what those ways are or how I found it, but there are ways out there, people, of finding this movie. It's not always pretty. It's definitely unsettling, but it's just a very vibrant, unforgettable entry. I think in the whole canon of these summer camp films and I feel like this movie deserves more love and more discussion, and just maybe don't give any of the campers too much power. After if you're working in a summer camp, just don't and you watch this movie, don't give any of the campers too much power after you watch it, because I mean we don't want uh, anything to happen like what happens in this movie. But yeah, definitely. All jokes aside, check this movie out. I definitely recommend it. Um, but moving on now, I guess I'm gonna get another drink real quick because man, it is hot as fuck, and I'm getting dry throat. So gotta wet my whistle before I move on. So now let's talk about a movie that I grew up with. This movie, I grew up in the '90s, and this was a movie that I loved, that I watched multiple times because just not because the film is great, but it's because I also was a huge fan of Christopher Lloyd and his whole vast and versatile career. You know, so I recently, like I said, I watched this movie this week. This is Camp Nowhere from 1994, and this is a very quirky, family comedy that really captures that unique blend of, of youthful rebellion and just that that classic, eccentric style of Christopher Lloyd. While Christopher Lloyd, often shrines, blockbuster hits and cult classics like Back to the Future, the Addams Family movies from the '90s. He was in Taxi, which is one of the I feel like is one of the all-time greatest TV shows. Um, and Camp Nowhere really offers this kind of offbeat. It's a very charming feel to it. It really showcases his talent here, and it's nestled within this kind of film that really embodies, the spirited, the essence of the 1990s, coming of age genre. Um, so I'm gonna tell you what Camp Nowhere is all about. I mean, it is a family comedy that just revolves around this group of kids who are just more than fed up, with this idea of going to all these different summer camps, and you know they want this place that traditionally represents, or they don't want to go to these camps where these kind of that have this traditional representation of like a forced fun. It's dictated by adults. So the story centers on these eighth graders who hatch this plan to avoid going to all these different summer camps that they don't want to even go to by creating this fake camp of their own where all the friend group can go to this one camp, and this camp is just a free for all where they can do precisely what they want without any supervision. So, to pull off this plan, they have to convince this kind of washed up drama teacher named Dennis Van Welker, who's played by Christopher Lloyd, to act as their camp director, which given would give this fake camp kind of a legitimacy. So the plot cleverly kind of weaves these elements of this childhood fantasy with scheming. The kids rent this dilapidated summer home, and with Dennis's theatrical flair, they enlist him as their front man to deceive their parents and the local authorities. And what follows is just this hilarious and heartwarming adventure, just full of slapstick humor and heartfelt moments and just this kind of subtle message about independence and creativity and um, just the importance of friendship, and Christopher Lloyd's Dennis is an extraordinary character. I mean, unlike his more iconic roles like Dr. Emmett Brown in Back to the Future or Uncle Fester in the Addams Family movies, and so forth. Here he displays this kind of gentler, yet delightfully quirky mentor figure, just full of enthusiasm, for these youthful kids and just artistic expression. And Christopher Lloyd's kind of signature animated, mannerisms and that comedic timing, it really enriches this movie, grounding like the children's kind of hilarious escapades with this kind of sense of warmth and sincerity. Um, he really embodies that rare, mentor who knows how to balance discipline with freedom, which is, I think, a theme that's central to this whole film's spirit. Um, but Camp Nowhere, other than Christopher Lloyd, it features this talented cast, including Andrew Keegan and Jonathan Jackson, and another Back to the Future alumni, and Thomas F. Wilson, who was Biff in the Back to the Future movies. Burgess Meredith is in this, and then we even see a very early role from Jessica Alba, And the film just explores all these themes, that's familiar to anyone who's ever, battled against expectations and, kind of sought the freedom to make their own rules. Um, it's a very universal, appeal that resonates well beyond its, family friendly exterior. I feel, the film was directed by Jonathan Prince, who is, perhaps not a household name or anything, but he was a very accomplished, figure in just in television and film. So Jonathan Prince is primarily known as like a TV producer and writer and occasional director, but like he's not like one of those household names or thing. You know what I mean? But although Camp Nowhere, represents Jonathan Prince's most notable credit, as a director, he really carved out this kind of strong reputation as a producer and writer in the small screen arena. Um, just that understanding of character driven narratives, it lends this film a grounded yet kind of whimsical quality to it. Which I think perfectly is suited for a family comedy about children reclaiming control of their summer. Um, but while Camp Nowhere, it didn't set any box office records or anything like that, or really even kind of make any kind of significant splash. At the time of its release, um, still think its legacy is one of a cult favorite. This is one I just kind of discovered on accident as a kid when roaming the video store because on the front and center is Christopher Lloyd, and me being already an established fan of Christopher Lloyd in the films and stuff that he was a part of. That's really what draw me to this, and I think the same can be said for a lot of people who uh, who grew up loving this movie, and that's why it's become this cult favorite at this time. Especially for kids that grew up in the '90s, and it just I think it just it resonates with all those fans of '90s nostalgia and these family comedies. But for Christopher Lloyd fans, just the film adds this kind of delightful dimension to his already diverse filmography by showcasing his ability to to kind of inhabit this slightly different kind of comedic character, which is less frenetic than Doc Brown, but equally memorable. And over time, Camp Nowhere has just kind of excavated, a place in the hearts of audiences who grew up in the early '90s, and just that the film's message of just that emphasizes independence and creativity and just that joy of childhood mischief really remains timeless. Um, and just continues to appeal to to new viewers. That's discovering it through like streaming platforms. Like I think this movie is on Disney Plus, so that's where I watched it this past week because I don't actually own it on any kind of physical media, which I should though, because physical media is king. But anyway, this movie it captures like a pre-digital era where children relied on imagination and friendship and and stuff like that instead of being glued to their phones, their tablets, and their computers and stuff like that all the time. They just they would create these plans. They come with these plans to create their own fun, and just which is really a sentiment that resonates deeply in today's fast paced screen heavy world. Um, and Christopher Lloyd's participation, I think, arguably helped this movie endure in making people aware. And like I stated that earlier, that was the biggest reason why I checked out this movie as a kid because I loved him in Back to the Future and Adam's Family and Dennis the Menace, which came around, which is funny because his character in this his name is Dennis, and he was like the villain in Dennis the Menace. So, like I said, those movies that came out around the same time as this one. But just his presence within this film really lends it a layer of credibility and nostalgic allure, given his reputation and just his character as Dennis remains this really fun and piece of like creative freedom. Just fans of Christopher Lloyd really appreciate this film, such as myself, because it's an example his versatility in combining humor and warmth and quirkiness, all while kind of supporting these very young kids of that is the rest of the cast. Um, but I guess furthermore, the themes of Camp Nowhere really find relevance in discussions about these parent child relationships. The film really critiques these controlling parenting styles and celebrates collaboration between these generations. So this kind of thoughtful underpinning really distinguishes it from these more frivolous fare and grants and enduring appeal to parents and children alike. But I guess overall, Camp Nowhere, is this just very underappreciated gem, in my opinion, of the early '90s. That does justice to its intelligent, premise, thanks in large part to Jonathan Prince's direction and Christopher Lloyd's performance. Um, and just for fans of Christopher Lloyd, it offers that refreshing look at his ability to embody this kind of offbeat, adult figure who champions, youthful spirit rather than stifles it. Um, and just th- Going back to what I was saying about this being like a cult favorite, I think that really reveals that lasting power of stories that combine humor and heart and just a bit of that harmless rebellion. It remains to me this kind of joyous celebration, that summer mischief, that creativity, and that timeless wish of every child to run away to camp on their own terms. For anyone want to just kind of indulge in nostalgia, and if you're a fan of Christopher Lloyd, if you're a fan of summer camp movies, Camp Nowhere is an absolute must watch. Uh, but now moving on to the next one. So this next movie is possibly one of my absolute favorite summer camp movies from any genre. I mean, this movie is right up there, amongst the summer camp comedy greats like, Meatballs or Wet Hot American Summer. Um, but if you ask me to pick what I feel is the underappreciated one of the genre, especially from the '90s, the answer for me is loud and clear, and that's Heavyweights from 1995. This movie isn't to me isn't just a summer camp movie. Um, is this movie is a feel good, fight the power, laugh until you cry summer camp film. And it's elevated by this all time great comedic villain. So it hits every single beat that you want from this kind of story, and then some. It delivers this message about self acceptance, without ever getting preachy or anything. So at its heart, Heavyweights is the story of this group of kids who were sent to Camp Hope, which is a summer camp specifically for children who need to lose weight. And our main character here is Jerry Garner, who's this sweet, slightly awkward kid who's being sent away to camp for the first time, promising his parents that he'll come back 60 pounds lighter or whatever it is. Um, and all the kids in this are this kind of motley crew of these lovable misfits. There's these cool kid exceptions like Jerry's friend Roy, played by Kenan Thompson, and then you got the quiet ones that are that kind of find their voice, and then you got like the wisecracking tough guys like Josh. And then there's a kid like I think his name was Sam. He's always hungry. They arrive, expecting this summer of like light exercise, healthy food, maybe a little fun, hoping to return home feeling better about themselves. However, their expectations are immediately tossed out the window when they discover the camp has been bought out from from the kind traditional owners, the Bushkin family. by this hyper energetic, completely unhinged fitness guru named Tony Perkis, um, which is played geniusly by Ben Stiller. And Tony Perkis isn't just intense; he's a complete tyrant. I mean, he throws away all the junk food that these kids are like stuffing in their beds and stuff like that. He replaces them with all this crap that they have no interest in eating, that they find absolutely gross, and he replaces all the traditional camp activities with this grueling, like humiliating workout that he calls percusizing. And he installs hidden cameras to monitor the kids and just generally makes their life a living hell. Under this disguise of promoting wellness and living the Perkis way. So the kids, they initially are feel demoralized and are miserable, and they kind of find that their shared suffering forges this unbreakable bond amongst one another. So they start small, they start smuggling snacks and staging these kind of minor rebellions. But as Tony Perkis's methods become increasingly extreme and bizarre, um, the campers realize they have to take drastic action. With the help of a you know with the just a few kind of sympathetic counselors. Notably like the lovable Pat Finley, who himself attended Camp Hope as a kid. So they decide to stage this kind of full blown takeover of the camp and lock Tony Perkis away, reclaiming their summer, and their dignity. So, without giving much more of the film away, in case a lot of people that's watching may have not seen it before, I could just say that this is a classic underdog story, wrapped up in the summer camp package, just kind of spiced with this sharp satire of fitness culture, especially for the '90s, but it's still relevant and just really just fueled by this pure comedic energy. And the director of this movie is Stephen Brill. So again, not maybe not a household name or anything like Spielberg or Scorsese or whatever. Um, Stephen Brill is absolutely, I think, a significant figure. Excuse me, in the '90s and 2000s American comedy, um, particularly known for his collaborations with Adam Sandler, and that whole crew that would become Happy Madison Productions. But his connection to the kind of films that Heavyweights represents goes even deeper than directing. He frequently works as a writer too, and he notably wrote the screenplays for the entire beloved Disney Mighty Ducks trilogy. And this is huge. Writing the Mighty Ducks means that he understands these underdog sports stories. These kids banding together and just finding strength. Through teamwork against this kind of formidable opponent. Which are themes that I think are absolutely central to Heavyweights. But going on to him being a director, besides Heavyweights, he's known for doing other films, either starring or produced by Adam Sandler, which really showcases his knack for kind of balancing that broad comedy with moments of heart. So, and his filmography includes movies like Little Nicky, which is one of my favorite Adam Sandler movies, ever, and then Mr. Deeds, amongst others. I think this most recent one he did was the Adam Sandler film Hubie Halloween from a few years ago. But Heavyweights really to me stands out, in his filmography, not just as an early directing effort, but as I think arguably one of his most beloved, enduring films, particularly just among a certain demographic. For kids in the '90s, this movie was huge. It perfectly captured that kind of specific blend of kid friendly rebellion and that adult aware satire that makes it rewatchable. And this is one that I would watch over and over and over as a kid. I absolutely loved it, and I always kind of like, um, partnered it with those Mighty Ducks movies, because a lot of the kids that are in this movie are in the Mighty Ducks movies as well. And but going back to that kind of cult classic, aspect of this movie, is this cult classic camp movie. It didn't set the world on fire or anything initially, but it really found its audience, on cable TV and home video, and just for a generation of kids that grew up in the '90s and the early 2000s. This movie was always on TV. It became almost like a sleepover staple, or a rainy day go to. This kind of repeated exposure really built this deep affection, and became familiar. Turning it from this kind of mid-tier Disney comedy into this genuine cult classic. And I've seen people discuss this online and reference it in memes with, especially with Ben Stiller's character. And it's just rewatched constantly by fans. I mean, this is a film that I definitely watch at least one time every year. I just showed this film to my son for the first time last year, and he absolutely loved this movie, and he's always asking about watching it again, all the time. So I just love that this film has kind of just found this audience amongst multiple generations. So yeah, I mean that's absolutely cool, and just like going back to Tony Perkis though, this iconic comedic villain portrayed by Ben Stiller. This is perhaps one of the most, I think, undeniable parts of the legacy of this film. So Ben Stiller's performance as Tony Perkis is legendary. He is this perfect storm of ego and delusion and just this intense physical comedy. Like the scene, like when he's like, throwing the glasses down and breaking and just walking on the glass, and that's towards the end of the film. But I mean, it's ridiculous and hilarious, and all the stuff is like these quotable lines like "lunch is canceled due to lack of hustle." I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's so funny to me. Um, just his rants, his bizarre workout gear, his increasingly like just desperate attempts to control these kids. He's a character that you love to hate, and Ben Stiller just plays him with zero hesitation. You know, um, Tony Perkins is just effectively hilariously awful that he really anchors the entire movie. He becomes this benchmark for kind of the over the top, comedic villains in kids movies. Um, and aside from that, while this is undeniably silly and filled with slapstick, the movie actually has this very resonant message within it. It doesn't shy away from that emotional pain that the kids feel about their weight and their body image issues. But crucially, the film's resolution isn't about them magically becoming thin. It's just about them finding confidence, and strength and self acceptance as they are. And just the victory isn't losing weight for Tony Perkins. It's taking back their power, and celebrating themselves. And, in a world, I think that's increasingly obsessed with like quick fixes and, unrealistic body standards, this message, of challenging, harmful authority and kind of valuing, that self worth over this external, validation or whatever, feels more relevant than ever. I think, it tackled these themes, within like this comedy framework, long before that they were these mainstream discussion topics. So, it was ahead of its time for sure. And but for a summer camp movie fan like me, Heavyweights is more than just a movie. It's a touchstone. It perfectly encapsulates that feeling of finding your place, among, other outsiders. Just that kind of exhilarating, rush of challenging these unfair rules, and just that simple joy, of just victory shared with friends. And going back, I've said it plenty of times now, but Ben Stiller's performance is just a force of nature. He's the kids are genuinely enduring in this, and and the laughs hold up to say. I mean, I'm always like, laughing constantly throughout this film every single time I watch it. It's so funny. It's got heart. It's endlessly quotable, and it it understands that unique magic and of being at summer camp. It really might not be held by critics or anything, but who the fuck cares? But in that world of movies that make you feel good, and you root for the underdog, and and maybe even hide a candy bar under your pillow or whatever, you know, heavyweights absolutely rules. That's all there is to it. This movie rules. And again, if it's another one of those films that you've never seen before, please take the time to watch this. This is such a good movie. Yeah, I don't know how anyone could not like this movie. Um, but now that brings me to the last film that I'll be talking about for summer camp week. Um, but as you know, this is not just because this is the end of summer camp week. This is not the end of summer. Summer is just beginning, and it's probably going to be hot as hell all this week. But if anything, we're gonna finish this summer camp week out with a bang. And as someone who practically lived in the VHS section, dedicated to these summer camp hijinks, throughout my formative years, watching all these movies that I have talked about, on this episode, and the last episode with the sleepaway camp films, and then even back, a couple weeks ago when I was talking about the Friday the 13th films, just devouring everything from the horror films like Friday the 13th and the Sleepaway Camp films, to that charm of comedy greats, like Meatballs and Ernest Goes to Camp and Heavyweights, and just everything in between. I thought that I knew the genre inside and out growing up. I could spot that shy kid, the jock, the awkward counselor, the climactic talent show, and just that that last day romantic drama, a mile away. But then came along this little movie from 2001, from David Wayne and Michael Showalter, and this movie is just absolute masterpiece. Uh, I love this movie so damn much, and this is Wet Hot American Summer from 2001, and it didn't just understand the genre; it took it and twisted it into this kind of pretzel of a pure absurdity. And and when I say that, like I mean this movie is absurd, but it somehow made it more perfect than I ever imagined. Um, so forget critically acclaimed or commercially successful. When this movie came out, for a true summer camp movie fan, Wet Hot American Summer felt like a transmission, almost like from an alternate dimension, where all of our beloved, slightly ridiculous camp film cliches were not just acknowledged but celebrated with a kind of a comedic deadpan glee. This movie, when it came out, it bombed. Okay, yeah, it did bomb, but it meant that it wasn't trying to please everyone. It was really speaking our language, to us that are fans of that whole summer camp subgenre. Because this was an absolute tribute to all of those movies that we grew up and loved, just in a very like satirical way. I mean, that language of like friendship bracelets, those awkward first kisses behind the mess hall, and or that earth shattering importance of that final day of camp, which is where this entire movie takes place, in this final day of camp. So the premise itself is very simple, and very genre appropriate, I think. So, like I said, it's the last day of Camp Firewood in 1981. Um, and every single theme that you can expect from a late 70s, early 80s camp movie is here. Just turned up to 11. Um, we have that lovelorn counselor Coop. He's pining after the popular girl Katie, who is dating this arrogant jerk Andy. And then we have these drama instructors Susie and Ben, putting on that make or break talent show. Um, we have just the weird arts and crafts counselor Gail, dealing with all this relationship drama. We have the camp director Beth just trying to keep it all together while navigating her own kind of awkward romance. And that's just scratching the surface. There's also that incredibly strange Vietnam vet cook Jean with these kind of questionable fetishes, and then you have the counselor Victor who's just desperate to lose his virginity, and just a whole bunch of other supporting players who are just equally committed to the bit here. Um, and what makes Wet Hot American Summer so utterly brilliant, especially for a fan of this kind of niche genre, is the tone. It's not just a parody, it's a saturation of that whole genre. It takes that sincerity of those original films, that kind of hormonal urgency of teenage life at camp, and um, just kind of filters it through this lens of complete, unwavering absurdity. Um, the stakes are, I think, simultaneously, everything and nothing. And if you watched it, if you don't understand it, if that confuses you, it should. But if you watch the movie, you'll completely understand. Will Coop get the girl? Will Victor lose his virginity? Will the talent show be a success? These are the questions of camp movies. But then, will a piece of Skylab fall in the camp? Will the cook have a heart to heart with a talking can of vegetables? Will a counselor be left for dead on a river rafting trip just so another counselor can try and go and get laid? So, Wet Hot American Summer answers yes to all of these questions. Um, the humor isn't just that slapstick. There's plenty of, like, physical comedy. Often kind of delivered with this very, surprising deadpan effect. Um, it's in the dialogue, which kind of veers from surprisingly insightful observations about relationships to the things that really make no sense at all. Like when the scene when Beth and some of the other counselors, they all go to town, and I don't want to say much more than that, but that's one of the most ridiculous scenes in the whole movie. And if you've never seen it before, I will not spoil that for you. But it's like, it makes no sense, but it lands perfectly because these actors in the film sell them with, like, such conviction. It's in the editing, which mimics a lot of dramatic montages from, like, 80s films. For, like, even mundane tasks like cleaning a plate. It's it's in the music cues, which kind of, swell at inappropriate moments. It's in that, that sheer commitment of the cast. These are accomplished comedic actors, and future dramatic stars playing these roles with just this absolute sincerity, treating this, these ridiculous circumstances as if they are the most important things in the world. And Paul Rudd in this, okay, so he plays Andy, who's this arrogant jerk, delivering lines with just utter, conviction. It's just a master class, and playing this theme straight while the world around him is just kind of collapsing into silliness, And then you got Christopher Maloney's intensity as Gene, the Vietnam vet cook for the camp. Whether, he's flipping burgers and like spouting out these crazy, almost like almost like he's got Tourette's or something. but he's always saying like these really like crazy out of nowhere things, or he's coaching Coop through this kind of workout montage. It feels like the Rocky 3 montage between Rocky and Apollo Creed. Um, it just feels like it's straight out of this kind of 80s um, 80s flick, and it's absolutely hilarious. Um, but and for me, as a camp movie fan, this film just feels like I said, like a collection of inside jokes. It understands that specific kind of angst, that desperate, clinging to like summer romances and friendships that feel like that they'll last forever, even though they probably won't. Be honest. Um, but it's just that the slightly neglectful camp leadership that we've seen in like so many camp movies. Janine Garofalo and as Beth, the camp director. She isn't this stern figure. She's someone who's trying to manage all the chaos while also trying to get laid by this quirky astrophysics professor next door that's played by David Hyde Pierce, and it just perfectly it just perfectly captures that feeling of this camp thread, this camp firewood as its own little universe, kind of governed by its own strange rules and priorities. We're falling in love, losing your virginity, winning the talent show, or just surviving this rogue piece of Skylab are all equally just pressing concerns on that final frantic day of camp. Um, and just going back to the creators of this, David Wayne and then Michael Showalter, who plays as Coop in the film. They wrote the screenplay. Clearly they had this deep affection for the material that they're parodying. This isn't a mean spirited parody or anything. It's very loving. It's a very loving satire. They they know why we love these movies. These the nostalgia, the low stakes drama, the relatable awkwardness, and they play with all of those elements. Like kids set loose in a candy store. So the film moves at this very crazy pace, just juggling multiple storylines that somehow all kind of converge together on within the talent show at the end of the movie. And it just really it introduces a lot of like new gags and characters, right up until the very end of the movie. But beyond its kind of initial commercial failure, and that kind of journey to cult status through DVD rentals and word of mouth and all that. Wet Hot American Summer, the legacy of this film is undeniable. It wasn't just a funny movie; it was a launching pad. Just seeing this cast, many of whom were known in niche comedy circles at the time, but hadn't broken through to mainstream stardom yet. You know, in these roles now, knowing where their careers went adds this another layer of enjoyment to it. This movie has Amy Poehler, Bradley Cooper, Paul Rudd, Elizabeth Banks. They're all here. Fully formed comedic forces, even in 2001, and just the fact that Netflix later brought back the entire cast for the prequel series, First Day of Camp, and then the sequel 10 years later, that's just a testament, I think, to that enduring love for this film and its characters. These follow ups, aren't just cash grabs, they feel like reunions. And I absolutely love that they did that. All of those actors were so passionate about this original project that they were all willing to come back for you know that first day of camp series and that the sequel 10 years later. It's like getting to spend more time at Camp Firewood with old friends, kind of picking up that absurdity right where it left off. And in that world of summer camp movies, Wet Hot American Summer is just that bizarre cool older cousin who showed up one year, changed everything that you thought you knew, and just left, this amazing mark. Um, it's not the average, coming of age tale, definitely not. Nor is it like, a pure slasher flick. I mean, there's nothing slasher or horror about this film. Um, but it does have some really weird shit in it. I will say that. But and it's not even that low budget comedy, full of tits and ass. It's something else entirely. This kind of hyper stylized, very deeply weird, incredibly funny tribute to that summer camp, subgenre that manages to be both a perfect send up and in its own strange way, a perfect example of why we love these movies in the first place. Um, it's quotable, it's rewatchable, and just endlessly endearing. And for this summer camp movie fan, Wet Hot American Summer isn't just a cult classic. It's a core memory for me here 24 years later after that original release. And I couldn't, um, think of a better movie to end this summer camp week on than Wet Hot American Summer. Um, please, if you love comedies, if you love summer camp movies, if you love any of the actors that I've talked about that are in this movie, please check this movie out. It is definitely one of a kind, and I absolutely love it. I think it's one of the best summer camp movies ever, even though it's just a tribute to all these summer camp movies that we grew up and we loved. I mean, it's still within that summer camp movie genre, and it's definitely up there as one of the greatest ever. Um, but guys, this has been so much fun this week. I loved doing this episode. I loved watching these movies again, talking about them with you. I love talking about on the last episode all the sleepaway camp films from the '80s. But this is unfortunately the end of summer camp week. Like I said, though, the summer is just beginning. We're almost at that halfway point now for the 500 movies in 2025 series. So, like I said, with Wet Hot American Summer, that's at movie number 247. So the next three movies that I talk about, which will be in just a few days from now, that will put me at that halfway point. And so that next episode will be on Thursday, July the 3rd. And if anybody who's a horror fan, that date should be synonymous with you. Because as on July 3rd is when the events of the original Return of the Living Dead took place. So this Thursday, I will be talking about Return of the Living Dead, but not just the first one. But I'm also going to be covering Return of the Living Dead Part 2 and Return of the Living Dead 3. So please tune in if you're if you're just a fan of this channel in general. If you're a fan of those Return of the Living Dead movies, I would love for you guys to join me on Thursday for that show. And just got a ton more stuff planned throughout the year. Like I said, we're about at that halfway point now. And we're halfway through the year, so this is all just panning out perfectly. Can't wait to have you guys join me for everything else I got planned for the rest of the year. Like I said, I really enjoyed doing this summer camp week, and I hope you guys enjoyed it just as much as I did. I want to thank all of you, for that who watched this live or if you're watching this on the replay. Just want to thank you guys for tuning in. I really appreciate you guys more than you know. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite from any of these movies are that I've talked about tonight. Or what if there's a specific summer camp movie out there that I didn't talk about this week that you love. Please tell me about it. Please, and let's have discussions about these types of things. I'm frequently checking my videos for comments. I try to keep up to date and interact with you guys as much as I can. I would love that. And as always, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. It would help me out a lot. And if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button below, to catch more videos like this one, like the ones I got coming up later, the ones that I've done in the past. And click that bell for any kind of future notifications. But with all that said, I'm Crater. This is Ernest. This is CraterMania. I love you guys and have a good night.